Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 293, Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland is almost here. It goes down on September 9th in Australia, and there is a lot to hate about UFC 293, but this is going to be my top 3 reasons I hate UFC 293. I'm going to start with some honorable mentions, then I'm going to get into my actual list, going from 3 to 1, 1 being the reason I most hate UFC 293. And that reason actually drives me nuts. I've talked about it many times on the channel. If you've been watching different videos I've been putting out for the last 2 months, you already know that reason. But this video was actually difficult to make because UFC 293 is so subpar. I just want to generically crap on the entire card. So that's what I'm going to start with an honorable mention. But I like to really dig deeper than the surface. I don't want to say, oh, this is a terrible fight, that's a terrible fight. I really want to give you legitimate, detailed reasons why I hate this card. I'm also going to do a top 3 reasons I love UFC 293, which is going to be crazy difficult. But if you want to check that video out, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That will be coming out very soon. But let's start with my first honorable mention, and that's just that the card is horrible. I made a video about it a couple weeks ago. I mean, you got Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland in the main event for the middleweight title. Co-main event, Tai Tuivasa versus Alexander Volkov. That is the co-main event. Featured fight on the main card, Justin Tafa versus Austin Lane. And that's not even where it's the worst. On the pay-per-view main card, we have Tyson Pedro versus Anton Turkalj. That's on a pay-per-view main card in 2023. We are paying $85, and a portion of that $85, at least in the United States, is going towards Tyson Pedro versus Anton Turkalj. That is insanity. If you're not a hardcore fan, you may not even know who those two fighters are. And that is on the pay-per-view main card of UFC 293. And sometimes you get these cards, and it's like, oh, the prelims, the way the card structure, you have some banging prelims. You know, a couple months ago, it didn't end up happening, but we had Jack Della Maddalena versus Sean Brady on the prelims. UFC 293's prelims are atrocious. The best fight on the prelims is probably Jack Jenkins versus Chepe Mariscal, and that's a super low-level fight, but that should be an absolute barn burner. But that's probably the best fight on the prelims. I mean, Carlos Ulberg versus Da Ung Jung. Does anybody really care all that much about that? Blood Diamond on the prelims. Oh, he's got a cool name. He can't fight at all, but he's got a cool name, and he's friends with Israel Adesanya, so he's on the prelims of UFC 293 in Australia. This is a horrible pay-per-view card, and the prelims look terrible. The main card looks terrible. But moving on to my next honorable mention and my last honorable mention, and that is one fight that got canceled on the main card, and that is Manel Kape versus Kai Kara France. I was really looking forward to that fight. 2 top-ranked flyweights, both close to title contention. I know Kai Kara France recently fought for an interim flyweight belt, but this was a big fight. And Manel Kape, he's looked so good, but he really hasn't got that big jump up in competition, really like a #1 contender fight here. At least it was for him before Kai Kara France pulled out. I'm super disappointed that that fight got canceled. That was a banger flyweight matchup. And if Manel Kape could have went out there and beat Kai Kara France, there's almost no doubt he would have been #1 contender. And the division has some turnover now because Alexandre Pantoja is now the new flyweight champion. So, I mean, there's a whole list of fresh contenders to fight Alexandre Pantoja. And instead of Brandon Moreno, Kai Kara France just lost to Brandon Moreno not that long ago. So this fight was super important for the division. Now instead we got Manel Kape versus Felipe Dos Santos making his UFC debut. Virtually meaningless, at least for Manel Kape, because if Manel Kape goes out there and finishes him in the first round, oh, well, he was supposed to beat him. If he doesn't look particularly great in this fight, oh, we got exposed. And then if Felipe Dos Santos wins, people won't even give Felipe Dos Santos his full credit. They'll just say, oh, Manel Kape was never really that good. So this fight's on the pay-per-view main card. It was such a better fight when we have Manel Kape versus Kai Kara France. Unfortunately, Kai Kara France had to pull out with a concussion. Super disappointed that that fight got canceled. Let's move on to my actual list. And I'm happy that UFC 293 gave me an opportunity to talk about a couple of these reasons on the list because I've talked about them in different streams, but I've never really had a reason to make a video on them. And the #3 reason I hate UFC 293 is because I hate hearing people say, it delivered. Don't judge a card on paper before it actually happens. Oh, it delivered. If UFC 293 has a bunch of exciting fights, which I hope it does, I'm not wishing it not to have exciting fights, you'll hear people say, oh, it delivered. If you didn't want to watch it, you shouldn't have watched it. Look how good it was. Everyone crapped on UFC 293, and look how good it was. I care to a certain extent how exciting a pay-per-view card is. I care to a certain extent how good a fight card is in general. But at the end of the day, for me personally, in my opinion, this may differ for you. If the fights are virtually meaningless, it doesn't matter how really exciting they are. To a certain extent, obviously, would I rather watch meaningless fights that are exciting versus meaningless fights that are boring? Yes, of course. But at the end of the day, if Tyson Pedro versus Anton Turkalj is an absolute barn burner, sure, we'll enjoy it in the moment, but it's meaningless to the division, It's like the only way I can compare it, if you watch football or the NFL, and you see an exciting game, the last game of the season, and they don't even have the starters in, because their playoff fates have already been determined. Or you watch a preseason game in the NFL, and it's an exciting game. It's meaningless. It's literally meaningless. So I hate when you have a really crappy card on paper, and then if it is exciting, which I hope it is exciting, again, I'm not wishing for it not to be exciting, but then if it's exciting, you hear a lot of Zuffa zombies and WME's sycophants and Dana White's sycophants. You hear them say, see, everyone crapped on 293 and look how good it was. It delivered. If the fights were meaningless, it doesn't matter how exciting they were. It doesn't matter. There's no implications to the division. There's no implications as far as contenders. There's no real answered questions in terms of skill sets. And for me, what's most important is not only having highly skilled fighters, not only having a fight that matters in the grand scheme of things, but it's just like having an exciting fight is only one component to that. I want highly skilled fighters. I want a fight that means something in the division, and then I want it to be exciting. You can go to the bar on a Saturday night and see two drunk guys and have a relatively exciting bar fight. And I get it. All fights can't meet all those criteria. But the fact that the featured fight on the card, Justin Tafa versus Austin Lane, does it really mean much for the division? And maybe it does. The heavyweight division is super low level and doesn't really have a whole lot of talent in the heavyweight division. It's probably the lowest skill level division in all the UFC. And maybe Austin Lane or Justin Tafa could rise up to the ranks, because really rising up to the ranks only requires like 2 or 3 wins. But Tyson Pedro versus Anton Turkalj, does anyone think they're going anywhere, even at light heavyweight, which isn't the best division itself? It's a lot of meaningless fights. Even if they do turn out good, they don't mean anything. So for me, they don't mean as much at all, even though they can be exciting. And I just hate to hear people act like the card is vindicated because we had some exciting fights. It just gives the UFC more of an excuse to build these pay-per-view cards with fights that don't really mean anything, and therefore we're getting less for our money. I hope that makes sense. Moving on to my number 2 reason I hate UFC 293, and this can be boiled down to one sentence that I've heard time and time again since UFC 293 was announced, and that is, I'm looking more forward to the press conference than I am to the actual fight. People hyping up the Israel Adesanya and Sean Strickland press conference. Now, will the Adesanya-Strickland press conference be more notable than maybe some of the other press conferences we've seen? But really, what does that really mean? We're going to have Strickland launch off some, unhinged remarks and talk about Izzy painting his nails and painting his hair. And I'm sure people will get some laughs. And I'm sure there might even be something that I find a little bit funny. Strickland has said stuff in the past that I've found a bit funny. But at the end of the day, if you're that focused on a fight in terms of just the press conference, but you don't even think the fight's going to be good, why don't you just go watch WWE? That's what they do. That's exactly what they do there. And I don't want to sit here and just crap on it and say, oh, well, the press conferences are meaningless. I used to watch the press conferences, religiously. I used to watch them nonstop when I first became a fan. Now I don't really tune into them. I just check out some clips. If there's some interesting clips, I check them out. Usually they underdeliver, and I hope this press conference delivers. But at the end of the day, for me, even the best version of this press conference, it just, I don't know. I can't even, it's hard for me to even explain what I mean. But it's like, if Sean Strickland goes out there and let's say he just makes fun of Izzy relentlessly and talks mad crap on him, and it's just, oh, he really sick burn there. I just feel like it's WWE-esque, which I feel like the UFC is slowly creeping towards on the spectrum towards WWE. And then on top of that, it's like, okay, again, the UFC uses this as justifications, as a justification to make fights that don't really matter. And then if the fight is terrible, what did that really mean? Are people really going to look back on that? Yeah, I paid $85 for the fight card, but the press conference was really good. The fight card wasn't that great, but I really sure loved the press conference. Strickland getting those remarks in on Adesanya and then potentially losing. Now, if Strickland does it and wins, it's a whole different storyline there. But if Strickland goes out there and talks mad crap, and then Israel Adesanya goes out there and easily beats him, whether it's by decision, whether it's by finish, then essentially it's like one of those videos where some guy on the streets talking mad crap and everyone wants to see him get punched in the face. And then the guy that he's talking crap to just brutally KOs him and everyone's watching the videos like applauding this person. They're like, yeah, you really got him. It's like, is that what we really want to see? We're just seeing a guy who talks and talks and talks and then gets brutally KO'd or gets outclassed. Does that, I mean, it's just shit talking. That's it. You're just proud of shit talking. So I just hate hearing that line. I don't care about the press conferences. I understand some people will enjoy them. And I hope the press conference for 293 is everything that you could ever hope for. But for me, if the fight doesn't deliver, what does it really matter? I think back to Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 1. When it was on short notice, they had that press conference in the gym. And that was one of the best press conferences I've ever seen because also it was really, it felt like really genuine. It didn't feel like Conor was putting on a show. It didn't feel like Nate was putting on a character. And sometimes Strickland, the way he acts, it just seems like, okay, he's just shouting whatever he can think of off the top of his head. And it's really of not any real substance. It's just insults. And then if he goes out there and doesn't even put up a competitive fight, it's just an embarrassment. It's going to be one of those things, when acting hard goes wrong, and it's basically going to be Strickland talking mad crap at the press conference. Then we're going to have to see Izzy share all those memes afterwards of Strickland talking mad crap beforehand, and then it's going to be the highlight of Izzy beating him up. Now, again, if Strickland goes out there and wins, it's a whole different ball game. But I just hate people justifying this fight being booked. It comes down to this. My number 2 reason is people justifying Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland being booked based off an entertaining press conference, potentially an entertaining press conference. Moving on to my number 1 reason I hate UFC 293, and that is that the UFC did not book Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis. And I know there's going to be a lot of people saying, du Plessis was injured. What did you want the UFC to do? The UFC knew well ahead of time when they were making this card. They knew who they were putting on this card. They knew they wanted Israel Adesanya to defend his belt on UFC 293. They could have scheduled it a couple weeks later. They could have scheduled Dricus du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker a couple weeks earlier. They knew whoever won at UFC 290 was going to have to make a 2-month turnaround. And they should have, because they knew this fight card was taking place. I think this fight card was announced in late April, early May. They should have made the decisions they needed to make to have it where the winner of Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis could make that turnaround. They could have 3 months. They could have 3.5 months. They could have 4 months instead of 2 months. You want Dricus du Plessis to turn around on 2 months to fight Israel Adesanya, the biggest opportunity of his career. And I just feel like the UFC made all the wrong decisions. They could have planned this out accordingly, and we should have gotten Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis as the main event of UFC 293. And on top of that, what makes this so disappointing to me is the fact that it felt like after UFC 290 when Dricus went out there and starts Robert Whittaker, shocked us all, and then they had the in-cage stare down afterwards, which I didn't particularly love, but people got hyped up over that. It felt like, okay, there's no way Dricus du Plessis doesn't fight at 293 in 2 months. So what I was so hyped about was like, okay, it's very rare we get a fight where we find out who's fighting for the title, and then boom, 2 months later, it's already happening. It's like we fantasize about a fight that's being made, and then it takes 5 or 6 months to be here. Think about the people who were excited about Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. That got announced, what, in January, late January, early February? That fight still isn't even booked. We don't even know a date for it. It's probably not even happening this year. So think about that. And that's happened time and time again where fights, we know this is the next fight, but it doesn't get booked for a long period of time. And it felt like, okay, Dricus du Plessis just brutally finished Robert Whittaker. You know, a month, 2 months beforehand, Israel Adesanya flatlined Alex Pereira. The momentums of both guys were skyrocketing. And now we're so hyped for this potential matchup, and we only have to wait 8 weeks for it. So it was super disappointing that Dricus du Plessis couldn't fight. It's not his fault. I don't think he should have been forced to turn around that quick. I blame the UFC for that, but that doesn't change my disappointment. I really wanted to see that fight. If Dricus du Plessis can go out there and TKO Robert Whittaker, all bets are off. He may have been the guy to go out there and create chaos and find a KO shot against Israel Adesanya. And also, he has the grappling too. You know, I don't think his takedowns are all that great, but his jiu-jitsu is very, very good. He's a big guy for middleweight. He's a strong guy for middleweight. And it's been a long time outside of Alex Pereira that we've seen a middleweight title fight booked and the perceived level of threat was as high as Dricus du Plessis. Now, I think a lot of people would have picked Israel Adesanya. But when you look back at Israel Adesanya's title fights, outside of Alex Pereira, you're looking at Robert Whittaker, you're looking at Marvin Vettori, you're looking at Jared Cannonier. Going into those fights, the perceived level of threat was not there. You didn't feel like, oh, this might be the time Israel Adesanya gets dethroned. You felt that going into the Alex Pereira fights. And think about how cool that felt. Think about how big that made those middleweight title fights. And you would have felt that with Dricus du Plessis. You would have felt that. And instead, now we're getting Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland, where people are gloating about the fact, oh, the press conference is going to be good. The fight may be boring. The fight may not even be competitive, but the press conference is good. We're going to hear Strickland talk about his painted nails and his dyed hair. At this point, I would have rather hear them argue about who breathes African air or not. I would have just killed for that at this point, even though I hate that storyline too. That was the much better fight. The UFC should have found a way to make that fight, even if they had to wait. They should have found a different main event for this card. Super disappointed that Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis is not happening. And that is why that is my #1 reason I hate UFC 293. Let me know if there's any other reasons I missed. Let me know if any of my reasonings on my list you agree with or disagree with. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.